To enter Rome in the year 1600, or rather, in this specific case, to step even further back to the year 1500, the year of the Great Jubilee, we must first silence the modern cacophony. Forget the incessant buzz of motorized scooters, the flow of tourists with cameras, and the electric lights that illuminate the Colosseum at night. Erase the luxury storefronts along Via del Corso and remove the black asphalt that covers the ancient cobblestones. What remains is a city of deep silences and organic sounds, an urban landscape that seems to have shrunk inside an armor far too large for its body. We are inside the Aurelian Walls, but the inhabited city occupies only a fraction of this space, clustered along the curves of the river, while vast green areas of vineyards and solitary ruins dominate the landscape. The sunlight of 1500 illuminates a Rome of brutal contrasts. The air carries the scent of incense from the churches, mixed with the pungent odor of livestock and open sewers. As you walk toward the Roman Forum, you do not encounter a preserved archaeological park, but a dusty pasture known as the Campo Vaccino, the cow field. Where senators once debated the fate of the ancient world, herds of cattle now graze among broken columns that rise from the ground like the bones of a giant half-buried skeleton. Vegetation overtakes the triumphal arches. Ivy and shrubs grow in the cracks of the marble, reclaiming the stone for nature. The prevailing sensation is that of living atop the ruins of titans. The ancient structures are not untouchable monuments, but living quarries and improvised shelters. You see smoke rising from shacks built inside Roman theaters and artisan workshops, nestled within the foundations of pagan temples. The silence is broken by church bells, marking the canonical hours, and by the sound of hammers and chisels. There is an energy of reconstruction in the air, but it coexists with omnipresent decay. The observer who arrives here feels the weight of millennia beneath their feet, walking through a city that is, at once, a cemetery of empires and the cradle of a new and ambitious Christendom struggling to rise again from the mud. The existence of Rome in this location and its configuration in the year 1500 are dictated entirely by its temperamental relationship with water. The city clings to the bend of the Tiber River, the Tevere, as if it depended on it to breathe, even though it is also its greatest threat. The waters are muddy, heavy with sediment, and flow with a force that frequently overflows, flooding the low-lying areas where most of the population lives. The urban geography is no longer spread across the 7 hills as in antiquity. The people have descended to the Campus Martius, the alluvial plain along the river's curve, seeking proximity to the water needed for trade, hygiene, and crafts. The famous hills, the Palatine, the Aventine, the Caelian, are largely deserted, dotted only with isolated monasteries, villas of noble families, and silent ruins, because the ancient aqueducts that once carried water to the heights were cut centuries ago. Life therefore concentrates dangerously along the riverbanks. The river is the main road. Barges arrive from the port of Ostia carrying grain, wine, olive oil, and marble. You see floating mills anchored in the middle of the current, harnessing the force of the river to grind the wheat that feeds the city. Bridges are few and vital, strategic funnels that control movement between the 2 banks, especially the Ponte Sant'Angelo, which leads to the Vatican. This geography creates a dense, labyrinthine city on the plain, surrounded by a ring of rural emptiness within the very walls themselves. Rome's strategic location in 1500 is no longer military in the imperial sense, but spiritual and symbolic. It is the point of convergence for all the roads of Christian Europe. The uneven terrain and ancient ruins now serve as landmarks for pilgrims who, exhausted, glimpse the city from afar. The geography here tells the story of a necessary retreat. The population contracted toward the river to survive, creating a vibrant and chaotic urban core surrounded by the geographic ghosts of its former greatness. Daily life in Rome in the year 1500 is a visceral spectacle of faith, commerce, and survival, unfolding through narrow, muddy streets that rarely receive direct sunlight. As you walk through them, you are immediately engulfed by a heterogeneous crowd. Because this is a Jubilee year, the city is swollen with pilgrims arriving from every corner of Europe. They walk in dusty rags, speaking dozens of different languages, disoriented and awestruck, seeking salvation in the sacred basilicas. They sleep under porticos, buy lead medals, and mingle with local residents, creating a constant, noisy human flow. The day begins early with the sounds of markets such as Campo dei Fiori. Here, daily routine is anything but solemn. Butchers cut meat in the open air, fishmongers shout the offers of the day brought in from the river, and peasants from the surrounding countryside sell vegetables. The smell is a dense mixture of roasting food, tanned leather, horse manure, and the cloying stench of garbage piled in street corners. There is no modern sewage system. The street itself is the drain. Amid the crowd, clerics dressed in red and purple push their way forward with arrogance, protected by guards, standing in violent contrast to the poverty of beggars who hold out their hands at church doors. Women are less visible in public life than in other cities, with the exception of courtesans, who in Rome form a distinct and highly visible class, often living in luxury and influencing local culture. The sound of the city is also the sound of manual labor. Blacksmiths hammering metal, stonemasons carving ancient stone for new buildings, and washerwomen beating clothes along the banks of the Tiber. Food is simple for the common people: bread, diluted wine, vegetable soups, but the banquets in cardinal palaces are legendary. It is a life of extremes, where the sacred and the profane not only coexist, but physically collide in the tight streets, where a religious procession may cross paths with a cart of wine barrels at any moment. Power in Rome in the year 1500 is undergoing a fundamental geographic and symbolic transition. Although the ruins of the Palatine still whisper of the power of the Caesars, the true center of command now lies on the other side of the river, the Vatican. But do not imagine the open, geometric square of today. The Basilica of St. Peter, as seen in 1500, is a strange patchwork. The old Constantinian basilica is decrepit, leaning dangerously, while plans for a new and colossal structure begin to take shape in the minds of visionary architects and ambitious popes. Power reveals itself in the dust of these works, in the demolition of the old to make way for the new. The fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo, originally an imperial mausoleum, rises like the Pope's clenched fist, a brutal and imposing military structure that dominates the landscape and serves as both refuge and prison. It is here that the temporal power of the church appears armed and vigilant. The main streets are not broad avenues, but the Via Alessandrina, the precursor to the Via della Conciliazione, is beginning to be opened, tearing through the medieval fabric to create straight passages that demonstrate papal authority over urban chaos. Power also resides in the fortified palaces of the great Roman families, the Orsini, the Colonna, which function as microstates within the city, complete with their own watchtowers and private armies. Architecture is not merely shelter. It is a political statement. Every new church, every travertine facade taken from the Colosseum and reused in a Renaissance palace is an act of domination. The decisions that shape the Christian world are made in rooms adorned with freshly painted frescoes, where art serves as propaganda for legitimacy. The financial market, controlled by Florentine and Sienese bankers, operates in the shadows of these great buildings, financing wars and construction alike. Power in 1500 is visible in the ability to transform stone, to rewrite the urban landscape, and to mobilize both armies and the faith of the masses who kneel in the city's dirty squares. The vulnerability of life in Rome in the year 1500 is palpable at every corner. The city is a fragile organism, constantly on the verge of collapse. The greatest danger comes, ironically, from the very source of its life: water. Floods of the Tiber are frequent and devastating. Without modern containment walls, the river rises quickly after heavy rains, invading homes, destroying food supplies, and leaving behind a foul-smelling mud that, under the hot sun, becomes fertile ground for disease. Malaria, or malaria, bad air, is a constant presence during the summer months, an invisible killer that drives away anyone who can afford to flee to higher ground or to the countryside. Human violence is another layer of constant tension. The streets at night are dark, lit only by occasional torches and oil lamps placed before sacred images. Crime is common, and justice is often carried out by one's own hand or through bloody vendettas between rival families competing for control of the papacy and the city. Political factions turn entire neighborhoods into zones of urban warfare, stretching chains across streets to block the passage of enemy horsemen. The political instability of the Borgia papacy adds a layer of paranoia and intrigue that seeps into conversations in markets and taverns. Beyond this, the city lives under the permanent shadow of the plague. Epidemic outbreaks appear without warning, cutting down cardinals and peasants alike. The lack of basic sanitation, with sewage running through the same streets where children play, creates an environment in which death is a familiar neighbor. Fire is also a constant risk in a city where many structures are still made of wood and packed tightly together. Rome in 1500 is not merely an open-air museum or a center of art. It is a place of daily survival where the sublime beauty of the Renaissance blooms from soil enriched by tragedy, disease, and a chronic insecurity that defines the human experience of the time. As we observe Rome in the year 1500, we are witnessing the exact moment when the medieval city begins to metamorphose into the Baroque and Renaissance metropolis we know today. The legacy of this period is the very skeletal structure of the modern historic center. The streets that were widened to accommodate the pilgrims of the Jubilee of 1500 are the same streets tourists walk along today. The decision to demolish the old Basilica of St. Peter in order to build a new one, made during this era, defined the most famous skyline in the Catholic world. The stones we see in Renaissance palaces are often marble stripped from the imperial ruins we have described, creating a city that is literally built from the flesh of its own past. The transition that followed would bring an unprecedented artistic splendor. Michelangelo and Raphael would walk these same dirty streets, imagining domes and frescoes that would define Western aesthetics for centuries. The city would cease to be merely an inhabited field of ruins and would become a planned urban stage with squares, fountains, and re-erected obelisks. The Roman Forum would continue to be slowly buried, preserving its secrets for future archaeologists, while the city of the popes consolidated itself above it. But the deepest connection to the present lies in Rome's atmosphere. The chaotic overlap of eras, ancient, medieval, Renaissance, which began to crystallize around 1500, remains the city's defining signature. Modern Rome, with its traffic and vibrant life, still pulses within the same walls and around the same bends of the Tiber River. The scent of history, the golden afternoon light, and the sense of eternity felt by visitors today all have their roots in this era of reconstruction. The past is not an untouched display case. It is the living foundation upon which life continues to unfold, layer upon layer. If you enjoyed this journey through the streets of Rome, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us which city we should reconstruct next.